Now, first of all, thank you so much everyone for having me here. It's a privilege and an honor to be presenting in front of all of you. Now, before I start, I'd actually like to acknowledge something. I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the Piscataway and the Kanoi First Peoples. So what does that mean? Now, so often in Canada, this is something that we say before our gatherings, before our speeches. We'd like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional land of the indigenous peoples of this territory. Now again, what does this mean though? Again, as all Sikhs, Hindus, Muslims, whoever we are here, we were not the first people to come here. This land has been inhabited for thousands of years by the first peoples. And that's why it's so necessary for us as Sikhs, or as humans in general, to acknowledge that we were not the first people here. Rather, we're on this stolen land from these other people, these indigenous people that are still with us today. So that's why it's so important to acknowledge this. Now, in 2016, I had the opportunity to travel up to the Arctic. So who here knows what the Arctic is? Just put your hand up if you know. So quite a few. Now the Arctic, well, it's fairly close to the North Pole where I actually went. So I went to the Arctic for 2 weeks. So I went to the Canadian Arctic, so that was some of the northern territories. So it was this territory called Nunavut, and then we sailed out of a bay over there, and we went all the way up to Greenland. Basically, the Arctic, it's frozen all year. There's constantly this layer of ice called permafrost that's there because it's the tundra. So regardless of what the temperature is, the climate of the Arctic maintains fairly similar. And the main reason the Arctic is so important, it's like the human heart. It's something that determines the health of the planet as a whole. So what that means is when the Arctic is healthy, when the ice in the Arctic is the same as it's always been for tens of thousands of years, that means our planet as a whole is doing well. However, when the Arctic is not healthy, that's when our world faces problems. Now, the reason I mentioned the indigenous territory in the beginning is the idea that these native people have been living in the Arctic for tens of thousands of years, yet as of the last couple of decades, that's when the major changes have been seen. So when I went to the Arctic in 2016, the main thing that I saw polar bears, I saw icebergs, amazing things, some things that you would never see in Washington, D.C. You know, it's so humid outside right now, I can't even believe it. But basically, going up to the Arctic, it was summer, so it wasn't that cold, and I remember seeing 9 polar bears one day. And these polar bears were on tiny pieces of ice. It was like they could barely survive. But I remember seeing all these amazing things. We even went swimming in the Arctic. You know, when I showed my mom pictures of that, she wasn't very happy. But apart from that, I saw whales, polar bears, these amazing creatures. And I remember some of the most amazing times that I had in the Arctic was this one day when we went to this ice fjord. So basically, for kilometers and kilometers, or miles and miles, we saw icebergs. We saw a vast expanse of icebergs going on for what seemed like forever. And I remember looking at that and thinking that we were invincible, that this was the end of the world, really. This was everything that we could ever see. But on this expedition, all 200 students and the 100 educators, which are scientists, historians, musicians, from all around the world, at that time when we all went silent for a second, we all went silent, and we could literally hear the icebergs melting. Imagine that. Millions of drops of water going into this beautiful sea. Millions of drops of water going into the ocean. And we heard that. I heard that with my own ears. I remember being in this state of excitement, but at the same time, I was amazed. And more than that, it was a bone-chilling experience because I realized that when we talk about the climate, of course, it doesn't snow that much anymore. Of course, it's sometimes warm, but that's not the climate. What I realized by going to the Arctic and seeing the icebergs melting in front of me was that everything is so intricately connected, and more than that, when the ice melts, it has major implications on us. So one example is, we're near Washington, D.C. right now. In fact, millions of people around the world live along the major coastal cities because the capital of Canada, the United States, major cities, major countries around the world, these capitals are located near the ocean. Now, if all of the icebergs and the glacier of the polar caps in the Arctic and Antarctic were to melt, then sea levels would rise by about 40 feet. 40 feet, that means all of Washington, D.C., all of New York City, all of the major cities around the world would be underwater. And the biggest problem there is that millions of people, or maybe even billions at that point, would be forced to move away. So again, when we talk about climate change, it's not something that's just an issue of the trees, it's not just an issue of the plants and the animals. It's an issue that affects every single human being. It's just like poverty. It's this idea that, imagine, one day you get a security warning that you need to move away from your land. Not only is it the idea that you have to move away, but imagine the trillions and trillions of dollars that it will cost the governments to move all of these people away, and who will suffer when this happens? The poorest people of our land, and of the different environments around the world. And that's what I believe is the biggest problem regarding climate change. Because when I went to the Arctic firsthand, I realized that climate change, it's not just an issue of the trees and the animals. It's an issue that impacts humans. It's an issue that impacts every single one of us. So when I came back from the Arctic, I was very inspired. And I realized that there was something that I had to do. So I was 14 years old at the time. I got in a scholarship to go on this expedition, and I was ecstatic. But coming back, I realized that there are so many problems facing our world. And I think the biggest issue is climate change, because it makes every single issue around the world, whether it's poverty or world hunger, or people serving those equally, racial discrimination. Everything that we see around the world, it stems from inequality. And climate change, we see that once the impacts of climate change once they fully reach their peak, that is when the poorest will suffer the most. In fact, there will be disparities throughout society. So in an effort to do something about this, in an effort to really understand what we can do as youth, but as a society as well, I started an organization called Break the Divide. So Break the Divide, it's essentially a network of youth from around the world who are able to connect with one another. So I'll share a little story. My older brother, he's 23 years old, his name is Sukhmeet Singh Sachal, and last year, he actually went to live in Inuvik in the Northwest Territories. So this is a place in Canada, in one of the northernmost places, where the weather reaches minus 50 degrees Celsius. So I don't know what that is in Fahrenheit, because again, I'm not an American, but really, minus 50 degrees Celsius. What happened was, if you threw water in the air, it would immediately turn into gas. That's how cold it was. Or, yeah, it would immediately freeze. So that's how cold it was, really. And understanding that, my brother, he was up there for 9 months. He lived in this Arctic region. He got to see all of these amazing things firsthand. But being in the Arctic firsthand, that's when he realized that climate change is very real as well. So some of the impacts that climate change has in these Arctic communities in Canada is that because the layers of ice are melting unevenly, the pipes beneath the surface are breaking. So these communities can't get access to clean water, or there's also food inequality. But if we look at an example of Florida, so recently I went to Florida to speak at a conference, and the youth that were over there, they talked to me about how Hurricane Harvey, although it didn't hit Florida too severely, these hurricanes, they are being worsened by climate change, and because of this climate change, millions of people are dying. So now we see in the world, there are climate refugees. Imagine that. And in the future, if nothing is done to stop this, there will be even more climate refugees. Millions of people that are fleeing, not persecution from other people, rather the world around us. And what does that mean? We all understand what it means to leave a land and come here. We are all here for the betterment of your families. Understandably, it's, this looking for a better life. That means everyone here come to America. America is a land of opportunities, as we all know. And coming here, it's for your families, it's for the future generations. And so often we talk about financial security in regards to our future generations, but what about the world around us? What about every single natural thing, but what about the stability of the climate as a whole? These ecosystems, just like EcoSikh talks about, these ecosystems are what keeps the world in balance, and without any of this, everything else goes to waste. Every other little campaign, or without the environment being secure, nothing really matters anymore. So I decided to do something about this. So I started this organization called Break the Divide. So with Break the Divide, what we do is we connect youth in the Arctic, we connect youth in Canada, and so in Vancouver, where I'm from, and in different places around the world. So most recently, we've been talking to youth in Cape Town, in South Africa. And currently in Cape Town, Cape Town is one of the most developed cities in Africa. And currently what's happening in Cape Town is there's been a water crisis. There's been a drought for about 3 years. So everyone in Cape Town is limited to using only about 12 gallons of water every single day. So I did that little conversion in my head right now. But essentially 12 gallons of water a day, if we put that into perspective, the average American uses about 350 liters of water a day. So that divided by 4 is about 90 gallons. So really, when we think about that, we use almost 10 times as much water as these people, yet they're able to survive. You know, they have some tricks that they use. When they're showering, for example, they put a bucket on the other side so that the water that they use over there, they can use that to flush their toilets. Another example is really in terms of the vast expanse of things. In schools, they limit their water usage. So overall, there are little things that we can do to really create this change. So we've seen with Break the Divide, these youth from Cape Town, South Africa, these places in India, in Punjab, where severe flooding has impacted them. We're talking to kids in the Arctic and in Vancouver, BC, where we've seen the climate change. We're talking to these people about what can be done to really create this change that we want to see. So essentially, in regards to the climate, again, it's not an issue of the future as it's so often talked about. Rather, climate change, it's really an issue that affects every single one of us. So really, as Sikhs over here, it's so important to understand that what we want is collective unity. We want collective action towards these issues for the prosperity of all humans, for the prosperity of everyone on this world. Now, the issue of climate change is, it's not just an American issue. It's not just a Canadian issue for me. Rather, it's a shared issue throughout the entire planet. It's an issue that will affect every single one of us, and in fact, it is affecting real people today. So, essentially what we really need to do is, as Sikhs, as every single person here, we need to address the large-scale issues. We need to go out into our world, do things like plant trees with EcoSikh, and I really commend the work that this organization is doing. As an outsider looking at this, I mean, I think it's absolutely incredible to see the unity that's been formed around this. So more than just being able to really work towards environmental change, I think the greater power of this is this concept of identity. So whether you're in Canada or America, this concept of identity is prevalent. This idea that we're all Sikhs here. There may not be some people who know about us, but what is our duty as a Sikh? It's absolutely to help other people. It's not to mindlessly do things, but rather to go out into our world and make a better life for everyone around us. And I found that so valuable. So I think at the end of the day, it really comes down to understanding that climate change is real. Now, next time you hear someone talk about climate change in a different way, you know, not to name anyone specifically, but maybe a president. Next thing you need to think about is, think about how Abhijit Singh Sachal, when I went to the Arctic, we all went silent for a moment, and we heard the icebergs melting. We heard icebergs melting. So collectively, it is our role to go out into our world, to not only support organizations like this, but also to change our own actions. Go out into your community and make that difference. Vote for leaders that will create the change that you want to see. Personally, in your own house, limit your light usage. Even though one person will not stop climate change, we can all collectively go towards making a difference. So again, if anyone wants to ask any questions, if there's any youth over here that would like to learn more about Break the Divide, or anyone, you can visit our website at breakthedivide.net. You can contact me on Facebook, Instagram, anything as well. And really, it's so important to understand that at the end of the day, we're all in this together. So let's go make that change.